My husband rented an apartment across town for another woman. I found out when I opened the door with the key he forgot to take off our kitchen counter. I said nothing. The young blonde woman standing in the apartment doorway smiled politely at me like I was a stranger who had knocked on the wrong door. Then she looked down at the overnight bag in my hand. "Oh," she said softly, "you must be the cleaning lady Richard mentioned." I smiled back. What I did next changed all of our lives. "I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end. And tell me where you're watching from. Sometimes betrayal travels farther than love ever did." The rain had started an hour earlier, turning downtown Chicago gray and blurred behind the taxi windows. I remember staring at the buildings while my fingers tightened around the spare key Richard had forgotten in his blazer pocket the night before. At 68, I never imagined I would become the kind of woman who checked her husband's lies. But for months, something inside our marriage had been quietly dying. Richard had become distant after retiring from his law firm. He stayed out later, protected his phone like it contained state secrets, started wearing expensive cologne too, business dinners, even though he no longer worked. And worst of all, he stopped looking at me the way a husband looks at the woman who built a life beside him. That afternoon, he texted me saying he was meeting an old colleague near Lake Shore Drive. But the receipt in his jacket pocket showed weekly flower deliveries to an apartment I had never heard of. Unit 14C. I told myself there had to be an explanation. I still believed that when I stepped out of the elevator. I still believed it when I knocked. But the moment that young woman opened the door wearing my husband's shirt, I realized something cold and terrible. I had already been erased from my own marriage long before I arrived there. I don't remember leaving the apartment building. One moment, I was standing in that spotless hallway listening to a younger woman call my husband, "sweetheart," from inside the kitchen. The next, I was sitting alone in the back of a taxi while rain streaked across the windows like blurred tears. But I wasn't crying. That was the strange part. After 42 years of marriage, I thought betrayal would feel louder. I thought there would be screaming or rage or some dramatic collapse people write about in novels. Instead, I felt cold. Quietly cold. When I got home to our house in Evanston, the porch light was still on. I had left it burning for Richard the way I always did whenever he claimed he'd be home late. The kitchen smelled faintly of the chicken soup I'd made that morning. His reading glasses still rested beside the newspaper at the breakfast table. Everything looked painfully normal. I stood there for a long time with my wet coat still on, looking at the life I had spent decades building. A life another woman was apparently borrowing while I was still alive. Upstairs, Richard's closet door was slightly open. Several empty hangers swayed gently near the back. I suddenly realized why he'd started donating old clothes last month. Half his wardrobe had already moved into that apartment. I sat down slowly on the edge of our bed and stared at the family photo on the nightstand. It had been taken 20 years ago in Cape Cod. Richard's arm around my shoulders, our daughter smiling between us. Back then, he used to look at me like I was home. My phone buzzed against the comforter. "Richard. Dinner meeting running late. Don't wait up." I read the message twice. Then I placed the phone face down beside me and smiled faintly into the empty room. Because for the first time in months, Richard had finally stopped making me feel crazy. Now I knew the truth. Richard came home a little after 10 that night smelling like cedar cologne and expensive wine. I was sitting in the living room with the television on low volume. Though I hadn't been watching it, the lamp beside the couch cast a soft yellow light across the room, making everything feel strangely calm, almost peaceful. "You're still awake?" he asked, loosening his tie as if this were any ordinary Tuesday night. I looked up from my tea and smiled faintly. "I couldn't sleep." He nodded absently and headed toward the kitchen. A few seconds later, I heard cabinet doors opening. "Did you eat?" he called out. Yes. That was all. 42 years together, and suddenly our marriage sounded like two strangers sharing an airport lounge. I listened to the familiar sounds of him moving around the kitchen. Ice dropping into a glass. The refrigerator door opening. His quiet footsteps across the hardwood floor. Normally, those sounds comforted me. That night, they felt rehearsed. Richard walked back into the living room holding a glass of bourbon. His sleeves were rolled halfway up his forearms, and for one painful second, he looked exactly like the man I married at 26. Reliable, handsome, safe. That was the cruelest part about betrayal. Sometimes it still wears the face you once loved. "You okay?" he asked finally, studying me more carefully now. I held his gaze for a moment. Then I remembered the blonde woman standing barefoot in his apartment wearing his blue Oxford shirt. The same shirt hanging loosely on his body now. "I'm fine," I said softly. He relaxed immediately after hearing that. Too quickly. As though my silence had become convenient for him. Richard sat in his usual chair and started talking about traffic downtown. Some old colleague he supposedly met for drinks. The weather forecast for the weekend. Lie after lie delivered in the calm voice of a husband who believed his wife would never question him. And I realized something as I watched him sip bourbon beneath the warm light of our living room. He wasn't afraid of hurting me anymore. He was afraid of losing comfort. There's a difference. I barely slept that night. Richard's breathing remained slow and steady beside me while I stared into the darkness, replaying every strange moment from the past 2 years. Once you know the truth, your mind starts reorganizing old memories. Little things suddenly stop looking innocent. Richard had started locking the bathroom door when he showered. He claimed he didn't want steam setting off the hallway smoke detector. He bought new shirts without asking my opinion, even though he used to joke that I'd dressed him since 1984. He stopped reaching for my hand during church services. Stopped asking if I wanted coffee in the mornings. Stopped noticing me altogether. Back then, I told myself that retirement had changed him. Men his age often became restless after leaving careers that made him feel important. At least that's what my friend Diane kept saying over lunch every Thursday. "Give him time," she told me last winter while we shared soup at a little cafe near Michigan Avenue. "Some men get strange when they feel old." But this wasn't about aging. This was about replacement. Around 3 in the morning, I quietly slipped out of bed and walked downstairs to the study Richard rarely used anymore. The room smelled faintly of leather and dust. His old law books still lined the shelves, untouched for months. I opened the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside sat a stack of unopened mail, receipts, and a small envelope from a jewelry store downtown. My fingers trembled slightly as I unfolded the receipt. Diamond pendant necklace, white gold. Purchased 6 weeks earlier. I swallowed hard. My birthday had passed 2 months ago with nothing more than a grocery store bouquet and a polite dinner reservation. But another woman had received diamonds. I carefully placed the receipt back exactly where I found it. Then I closed the drawer and sat alone in the dark study while the grandfather clock ticked softly in the hallway. 42 years. That was how long it took me to understand something painful. A man can slowly leave your life long before he ever leaves your house. The next morning, I made Richard blueberry pancakes. It had been his favorite breakfast since the first year of our marriage. Back when we lived in a tiny apartment above a hardware store in Milwaukee and counted quarters before buying groceries. Funny how love can survive poverty but not comfort. Richard came downstairs freshly shaved, wearing the grey cashmere sweater I bought him last Christmas. He kissed the top of my head absent-mindedly before pouring coffee. For a moment, he looked so normal that I almost hated myself for doubting him. Almost. "These smell amazing," he said. cutting into the pancakes while scrolling through his phone. I noticed he smiled at one message before quickly locking the screen. Her. The woman in apartment 14C. I buttered my toast slowly and kept my voice calm. Are you busy today? Just lunch with Greg from the old firm. He replied easily. Why? No reason. I thought maybe we could drive up to Lake Geneva this weekend. Like we used to. He hesitated. Just for a second. But after 42 years of marriage, I knew every silence Richard made. I don't think this weekend's good, he said. I may have meetings. Meetings. A retired man with secret meetings. I nodded and smiled politely. The same way women do when they already know the answer but aren't ready to say it out loud. After breakfast, Richard grabbed his coat and headed for the front door. Then he paused and turned back toward me. You seem quiet lately, he said carefully. I looked at him standing there in our foyer, holding car keys in one hand and lies in the other. Do I asked softly. His expression tightened almost imperceptibly. That was the first moment I realized something important. Richard wasn't expecting confrontation. He was expecting obedience. The kind wives learn after decades of keeping peace inside a marriage. But something inside me had changed in apartment 14C. I no longer wanted peace. I wanted the truth. That afternoon, I drove downtown to see Patricia Levin. Her office sat on the 17th floor of a quiet building overlooking the Chicago River. Richard had always handled our legal matters himself during his years at the firm. But Patricia was someone I knew independently through a women's charity board years earlier. Sharp, calm, impossible to intimidate. Exactly what I needed. You look exhausted, she said gently after leading me into her office. I managed a small smile. I think my marriage may be ending. Patricia didn't react with surprise. Women her age rarely did anymore. By 60, most of us had learned how ordinary betrayal really was. She waited quietly while I explained everything. The apartment. The younger woman. The lies. The hidden receipts. I noticed Patricia's expression change only once. When I mentioned the apartment lease. Richard rented it himself, she asked. As far as I know. She folded her hands together carefully. Elaine, whose name is on your house? Both of ours, I answered automatically. And the investment accounts? Mostly joint accounts. Why? Patricia opened a yellow legal pad and wrote something down before looking back at me. Because before you confront your husband emotionally, you need to understand your position financially. The words settled heavily in the room. For 42 years, I had thought marriage itself was protection. Now I realized paperwork mattered more than promises. Patricia spent the next hour asking questions I'd never thought to ask myself before. Who controlled the retirement accounts? Who managed property taxes? Were there trusts? Separate business holdings? Hidden LLCs? I felt embarrassed by how little I knew. Richard had always smiled whenever I asked about finances. Don't worry about all that. He used to say, I'll take care of you. Women from my generation were taught to hear those words as love. Sometimes they were. Sometimes they were simply control. Before I left, Patricia handed me a business card with her private number written on the back. Do not confront him yet, she said firmly, not until we know everything. I slipped the card into my purse and nodded. For the first time since apartment 14C, I no longer felt like a confused wife. I felt like a woman quietly waking up. For the next several days, I said nothing to Richard. That seemed to make him comfortable again. Men like Richard often mistake silence for surrender. I still cooked dinner, still folded laundry, still sat beside him during the evening news while he talked casually about traffic, golf, and stock prices. But now I watched everything. And once you start paying attention, The lies become impossible to ignore. Richard suddenly began taking phone calls outside on the back patio, even when the temperature dropped below 50 degrees. He smiled at his phone more than he smiled at me. One afternoon, while he showered upstairs, his cell phone buzzed against the kitchen counter beside me. A message preview lit up the screen. "Miss you already, heart." No name. Just a red heart. I stared at the message while the shower water ran upstairs. Then the second message appeared. "Dinner tomorrow, same place?" My stomach tightened, but my face remained calm. 42 years of marriage teaches a woman many things, including how to suffer quietly. That evening, after Richard fell asleep in front of the television, I opened the drawer of the console table in our hallway and found what I had started looking for days earlier. Bank statements. At first, everything appeared normal. Mortgage payments, utilities, insurance. Then I noticed recurring withdrawals from an account I didn't recognize. Large amounts. $3,000 here, $5,000 there. Always transferred near the first of the month. I copied the account number onto a notepad with slow, careful handwriting. The next morning, Patricia called me back after reviewing several documents I had emailed her. "Elaine," she said carefully, "there's something you need to understand." Her tone made my chest tighten. The downtown apartment isn't the real problem. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. "What do you mean?" "The account funding those payments," she continued, "appears connected to an LLC partially owned by your family trust." I stopped breathing for a moment. "My family trust?" "Yes," Patricia said quietly. "From what I can see so far, Richard may have used your own assets to support the affair." Outside the kitchen window, dead autumn leaves scraped softly across the patio stones. And for the first time since discovering the other woman, the pain inside me changed into something colder. Something sharper. Not heartbreak. Resolve. I stopped sleeping beside Richard 3 nights later. Not officially. I simply told him his snoring had become unbearable and started falling asleep in the guest room at the end of the hallway. He accepted the explanation almost too easily. That hurt more than I expected. A man fighting for his marriage would have noticed the distance. Richard seemed relieved by it. The guest room overlooked our backyard maple tree, now nearly bare from the November wind. Most nights, I sat awake beneath the soft lamplight with Patricia's notes spread across the bed beside me. The deeper we looked into our finances, the uglier things became. The apartment lease, luxury purchases, travel expenses, restaurant charges downtown, all connected to accounts funded partly through assets Richard had quietly moved years earlier. Assets connected to me. One evening, Patricia forwarded copies of several LLC documents to my email. I adjusted my reading glasses and stared at the screen for a long time. My name appeared beside Richard's. Primary beneficiary. Majority ownership rights upon marital misconduct. I blinked twice. Then read the line again. Richard had written those clauses himself nearly 12 years earlier when restructuring parts of his estate after a tax dispute. A lawyer. Destroyed by his own paperwork. For the first time in weeks, I almost laughed. The next morning, Richard came downstairs wearing a navy suit I hadn't seen in months. He looked almost energized while knotting his tie in the hallway mirror. "Big plans today?" I asked calmly from the kitchen. "Lunch downtown," he replied without looking at me. I nodded and stirred cream into my coffee. "Say hello to her for me." The silence that followed felt enormous. Richard slowly turned toward me. His face lost color so quickly it startled even me. "What?" I took a quiet sip of coffee. "The blonde in apartment 14C, I said softly. "The one wearing your shirt." For a moment, neither of us moved. Then Richard gave a short, nervous laugh. Elaine, this isn't what you think. Every cheating man in America probably says those exact words. I set my coffee cup down carefully and met his eyes. No, I replied calmly. I think it's exactly what I think. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Richard finally looked afraid. Richard sat down slowly at the kitchen table like his legs had suddenly weakened beneath him. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The coffee maker hummed softly in the corner. Outside, cold wind rattled the bare tree branches against the windows. Ordinary sounds. An ordinary morning. That's the strange thing about betrayal. The world keeps moving while your entire life quietly falls apart. Elaine, Richard said finally, rubbing a hand across his jaw. I can explain this. I looked at him calmly. After weeks of lies, explanations felt almost insulting. Her name is Vanessa, he continued carefully. It started after retirement. I was confused. I wasn't thinking clearly. Confused. Men always seem to become confused right around the time they rent apartments for younger women. I folded my hands together on the table. How old is she? His eyes flickered downward. 36. I nodded once. Young enough to be our daughter. The thought should have shattered me. Instead, it only made me tired. Richard leaned forward suddenly, desperation creeping into his voice now. It wasn't supposed to go this far. That sentence stayed with me. Not. I never meant to hurt you. Not. I still love you. Only. It wasn't supposed to go this far. Meaning the affair itself had never been the problem for him. Getting caught was. I want us to fix this, he said quickly. We can go to counseling. We can start over. I almost admired how smoothly the words came out. A man who lies long enough eventually begins performing sincerity like muscle memory. I met with an attorney yesterday, I said quietly. Richard froze. I watched the exact moment fear replaced confidence in his face. You what? She reviewed the trust documents. The color drained from his expression again. For the first time since our marriage began unraveling, Richard looked less like an unfaithful husband and more like a lawyer calculating damage. That told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't afraid of losing me. He was afraid of losing what came with me. The house. The accounts. The stability. The life I helped build while he slowly handed pieces of himself to someone else. Richard opened his mouth to speak again, but I stood before he could. I'm going to lunch with Diane, I said softly. You should probably call Vanessa. Then I walked upstairs without looking back. And downstairs, for the first time in decades, my husband sat alone. 3 days later, Richard asked me to meet him downtown. Neutral ground, he called it over the phone. As if our 42-year marriage had become a business negotiation. Patricia insisted on coming with me. The meeting took place in a quiet conference room at Richard's former law firm overlooking the river. The same office building where he had spent most of his adult life building a reputation for intelligence and control. Funny how quickly control disappears once truth enters the room. Richard was already seated when we arrived. And Vanessa sat beside him. She wore a cream-colored coat and diamond earrings I recognized immediately from the receipt in Richard's desk drawer. She couldn't have been older than 36, beautiful in the polished, effortless way younger women often are. But nervous. Very nervous. Richard stood as I entered. Elaine. Patricia cut him off smoothly. We're here to discuss financial disclosure. I almost smiled. Richard glanced toward Vanessa before sitting back down. I noticed the small movement immediately. Protection. Guilt. Habit. Perhaps all three. For the next hour, Patricia calmly reviewed documents across the conference table while Richard's attorney remained unusually quiet. That silence told me more than words could. Then Patricia opened the final folder. The downtown apartment. she said evenly, was funded through an LLC connected to Mrs. Bennett's family trust. Vanessa's expression changed first. Confusion. Then alarm. She slowly turned toward Richard. What does that mean? Richard didn't answer immediately. Because he already knew. Patricia continued calmly. Under the trust's infidelity and asset misuse clauses, Mrs. Bennett retains majority ownership rights over several shared holdings. The room became very still. Vanessa stared at Richard like she was seeing him clearly for the first time. Not as a sophisticated older man. Not as a successful attorney. Just another aging husband using borrowed money to finance a fantasy. Richard finally looked at me. Elaine, please don't do this. His voice sounded smaller now. Older. Tired. I met his eyes across the long polished table. Then I realized something surprising. I wasn't angry anymore. Just finished. I'm not doing anything, Richard, I said quietly. You already did it to yourself. Vanessa left Richard 2 weeks later. I heard about it from him, though he tried to describe it differently. She just needed space, he said quietly while standing in our kitchen one rainy evening. But I knew what really happened. Fantasy rarely survives paperwork, especially when the luxury apartment disappears. The credit cards stop working, and the successful older man turns out to be a husband draining his wife's assets to impress someone half his age. Richard looked smaller these days. Not physically. Spiritually. He stopped wearing cologne, stopped talking about golf. Sometimes I'd find him sitting alone in the den staring at nothing with the television muted in front of him. Regret has a very quiet sound. Meanwhile, Patricia finalized the legal separation with frightening efficiency. The trust protected most major assets exactly as she predicted. The downtown apartment was surrendered within 10 days. I never went back there. Some doors stop belonging to you the moment betrayal walks through them. One Sunday afternoon, our daughter Claire came to visit from Minneapolis. Richard had already told her part of the truth, though I suspected he'd edited himself into a more sympathetic version of events. Claire sat beside me at the dining table while rain tapped softly against the windows. I'm sorry, Mom, she whispered suddenly. I looked at her carefully. For what? For not noticing. Her eyes filled with tears. You always protected everyone else so well that I forgot to check if anyone was protecting you. That nearly broke me. Not Richard's affair. Not the lies. That sentence. Because mothers from my generation were taught to disappear quietly into service. To smooth conflict. To absorb pain without becoming inconvenient. I reached across the table and squeezed Claire's hand gently. I'm learning something very late in life, I told her softly. What? That loyalty means very little without respect. Upstairs, I heard Richard moving slowly through the hallway of the house that no longer felt entirely his. And for the first time in months, I realized I no longer felt afraid of being alone. Sometimes peace arrives only after disappointment finishes telling you the truth. 6 months after discovering apartment 14C, I sold the house in Evanston. Not because the court forced me to. Not because I needed the money. And certainly not because Richard asked me to stay. I sold it because one morning I walked into the kitchen, poured myself coffee, and realized the house no longer sounded like my life. It sounded like an echo. Richard moved into a condominium near downtown after the separation was finalized. Smaller place, smaller life. We spoke occasionally through attorneys and sometimes through Claire when necessary. But the marriage itself had already ended long before the paperwork arrived. Strangely enough, I didn't hate him. Hate requires passion. And by then, all I felt was clarity. I rented a quiet lakeside cottage in northern Wisconsin for the summer. Nothing extravagant, just a white porch, a small garden, and windows facing the water. Every morning, I sat outside wrapped in a cardigan while the lake stayed perfectly still beneath the sunrise. The silence there felt different from the silence inside my marriage. This silence healed. One evening, Claire visited with my grandson, Ethan. He helped me plant lavender beside the porch steps while Claire unpacked groceries in the kitchen. At one point, Ethan looked up at me and smiled. "Grandma," he asked, "are you happier here?" Children ask simple questions adults spend years avoiding. I looked out toward the lake for a moment before answering. "Yes," I said softly, "I think I finally am." And I meant it. Because losing Richard forced me to confront something painful. I had spent decades trying to be chosen by someone who slowly stopped seeing my value. But peace begins the moment you stop asking others to recognize what you already know about yourself. That night, after Claire and Ethan left, I stood alone on the porch listening to the wind move gently through the trees. No lies. No waiting. No feeling invisible inside my own life. Just quiet. Real quiet. And for the first time in many years, I no longer felt replaced. I felt free.